Freedom of expression is a staple in societies around the developed world, so much so that out of the 195 countries in the world at the moment, only a handful of them have laws in which people can be arrested for expressing an opinion. Free speech is a topic that is close to the hearts of many, especially those with an interest in history, and those who realize that once upon a time, not even that long ago, people were often and regularly put to death merely for speaking their mind. Could you imagine being put to death for disagreeing with somebody? Because not all that long ago, that was a reality. In many places across the world, it still is. But something changed in the early modern era, and one of the first ever declarations of free speech came during the late 18th century during the French Revolution. Since that time, it has spread so far and wide that many of us literally can't even imagine what living in a society without free speech would be like. Since free speech, the world has lifted itself out of the early modern age into the Industrial Revolution and beyond, leading to a globally connected world culture. Now, if you're anything like me, you understand the importance of free speech in society, and you also realize that it's not always pretty. Sometimes it can come with costs, in the form of hate speech, lies, propaganda, and misinformation. Many people feel that this justifies limits being put upon free speech, and maybe they have a point, but maybe they don't. I'm personally of the opinion that placing limits on freedom of speech opens a society up for much greater complications and threats than the opposite. With unlimited freedom of speech, you will have hate speech, you will have lies, you will have propaganda, and misinformation. But, and here's the important thing, you have the ability to disagree, tell the truth, refute, and correct. With limits on freedom of speech, truth is decided by the state, not by the individual. We now see growing noise over the necessity of free speech. I'm quite sure many of you guys can point out several notorious examples of people insisting that speech should be limited, but I'm forced to disagree with those people. I do not agree with hate speech, and when hate speech leads into incitement to violence or other illegal actions, then yes, it does need to be addressed. But for the most part, I feel that the speech itself is a necessary evil. Because as bad as it can get, you have the right to speak out against it. As such, this extends to the freedom of expression, something that we've struggled with before and likely will struggle with again. When I was a kid, there was something called the Comics Code Authority. Now, the CCA was formed in 1954 as an alternative to government regulation, allowing comic book publishers to self-regulate their content, essentially agreeing to a certain standard of expression in exchange for being carried by distributors. For those old enough to remember, it usually meant that pretty much every major comic book was about as exciting as Archie. Failure to adhere to the CCA standards meant risking not being picked up by distributors. In the 1980s, the CCA started to lighten up, and by the 2000s, it's all but been abandoned, even by Archie Comics, that held on to the CCA until 2011. And now, Archie's fighting zombies and the alien from Predator. I would say he's much more badass now. But now we're seeing a similar assault on the freedom of expression in video games. Once again, we've been through this before. Regulations on expression are not only arbitrary, but go against the nature of freedom of expression, and is an assault on the freedoms that are guaranteed to us by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Criticism of video games is fine. Choice on whether or not you carry a particular game in your establishment is fine. Attacking a creator, shaming them, or attempting to silence them? That doesn't fly. I want to be very clear that it's entirely likely that I will never play Hatred. It's not a game that I would feel particularly interested in much the same vein as I have never played the Postal games, because said games don't fit my taste. Just like I will never play Candy Crush. Although I find the themes surrounding Hatred and Postal distasteful, I would never attempt to stop people from playing them or insist that the developers involved cease developing. The reason why I couldn't do this is because I would much rather fight for my right of speech and expression. and it would be the height of hypocrisy if I weren't willing to do it even for those I disagree with. Regardless of opinion or content, speech and expression is something that we must defend even if we disagree with the speech being said. That way, things like hate speech are out in the open where we can see them, address them, and refute them, not hidden away in basements and meeting halls. I'd rather know that my neighbor is a bigoted psychopath by his words than to silence his words and find out the hard way. There is, however, one important thing to keep in mind about freedom of speech, and that's that we should always remember that a person is only as good as their word. When a person makes a promise, that's different than free speech. That's more akin to a contractual obligation than freedom of expression, and in cases of statements of actions, it's different. Hate speech, by and large, is just expression. Expression can be argued against and disagreed with. Hate speech that promises or demands that an action be taken against another is where the line has to be drawn. That falls more under intent or incitement. Think of a circle drawn around every person you meet. Outside of your circle, people can say whatever they like, but the moment that they begin to dictate that your circle is of a different size than theirs, or what you're allowed to do inside your circle, I'm sorry, but that needs to be addressed. Their rights end where yours begin. Anyway, guys, thanks for checking out today's episode. I also wanted to specifically give thanks to an anonymous Good Samaritan who, upon hearing that my motherboard on my last computer melted, generously lent me another until such time as I can afford a new one. Now, with that said, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know how you feel on the topic of free speech. Would you prefer that hate speech to be silent and pushed into the dark corners where they can't be heard? Or would you rather hear it spoken aloud in a place where you can respond to it if necessary? See you soon.